Hi everyone. I'm going to guess that by the mere virtue of the fact that you are watching this channel, you probably know what the Battle of Badon is. But in case you don't, just a quick summary, the Battle of Badon is the climactic battle that was said to have been fought by Arthur between the Britons and the Saxons, and it was essentially the grand finale of his Saxon campaigns, which established a period of peace that lasted for several decades. And this is a definitely historical battle because it's mentioned by Gildas, a 6th century writer, although he doesn't mention Arthur. The attribution to Arthur only comes from records in later centuries, but he doesn't say anything that contradicts the idea that it was Arthur either. But anyway, it's a famous battle, a very important battle. Now, a really interesting question, which has a lot of implications for a lot of things if we accept that it was fought by Arthur, is the question of when did it happen? Now, if you were to look online, then or look in any scholarly books for that matter, then you'll see that the overwhelming consensus is that this battle was fought around about the year 500, give or take a decade or two at the extreme levels. But usually scholars date it to about the year 500, give or take a decade. But if you've already read my book, King Arthur, the Man Who Conquered Europe, then you'll know that I date the Battle of Badon to about the middle of the 6th century, approximately half a century later than all these scholars and everyone else who writes things online. So what's my basis for that? Well, as I explain in my book, there's a lot of evidence from the chronology of Arthur's life. There's evidence that at least one of the men known as Gildas in the 6th century was born in the middle of the 6th century, and that fits the fact that Gildas said that the Battle of Badon occurred in the year he was born. And there's also a lot of evidence from the 5 contemporary kings that Gildas was addressing some of his comments to, that they lived in the late 6th century. And since he says that the Battle of Badon happened 43 years earlier than the time he was writing, that would accommodate a date of around the middle of the 6th century for the Battle of Badon. But something which I didn't mention in my book, and something which I basically never see people talking about in the context of this subject, is a certain prophecy that Gildas mentioned in his work, in his passage about the Saxons. Now, what he mentions is that at the time the Saxons arrived, there were oracles who spoke about this subject and said that the Saxons would be in Britain for 300 years, and that for the first 150 years they would be plundering the country, and then for the other 150 they wouldn't. So, to be clear, I'm not saying I believe that this was actually a prophecy, just to clarify. I am a religious person, as I said in a previous video, but I don't believe in prophecies outside of the Bible. But nonetheless, I don't think that this would have been mentioned by Gildas if it didn't tie in with everything else that he knew and that he wrote about. So it could have been a genuine prediction made at the time that the Saxons arrived, and then it could have just coincidentally worked out, or it could have been made up later after that peace had already been established. But in any case, I don't believe that Gildas would have mentioned it if it hadn't tied in with the other things that he knew, because he was already writing, or he was already living in the period after the plundering of Britain by the Saxons. He was living in the period of peace. So that the first half of what that prophecy covered, the plundering and then the not plundering, the peace, in other words, Gildas was already living in the second half of that. So he knew how long that first part, the plundering, lasted. So if it hadn't lasted approximately 150 years, why did he mention the prophecy? It doesn't add anything to the passage other than providing that chronological framework. So the only reason I can see why he would have mentioned it is because he knew that actually it did tie in with how long that plundering lasted. So the question is, if that plundering lasted 150 years, and the Battle of Badon marks the end of that period where peace was established, then if we can work out when the Saxons arrived and when they started plundering, then that would go a long way to helping us to establish when the Battle of Badon occurred. Now, the traditional date for the arrival of the Saxons is around about 449 or thereabouts, give or take a year. So if you count 150 years after that, that takes you to near the end of the 6th century. And I don't think anyone, not even I, would date the Battle of Badon that late. That wouldn't tie in with when Gildas was writing, unless it happened in the year he was writing, which I think one or two scholars may support, but that's a fringe idea, really. So that wouldn't work. On the other hand, if we count it from when the Saxons actually started plundering Britain, then things start working a bit better. Because actually we know that the Saxons started plundering Britain before they had been invited here by Vortigern. You see, in the Gallic Chronicle of 452, there's a record that says that in the year 409, the Saxons plundered Britain. And this is also supported by the Roman historian Zosimus, who reports that around the time that the Britons rebelled against the Romans and they expelled the Roman administration in the year 409, they did so because Britain was being overrun by barbarians from across the Rhine, which would match the Saxons. He doesn't name the Saxons, but he talks about the barbarians from across the Rhine flooding through Gaul and also causing trouble for the Britons as well. And because the Romans didn't do anything, the Britons expelled the Roman administration, rebelling against the empire. So again, that's the same year as when the Gallic Chronicle of 452 places this Saxon incursion of Britain. So the evidence is good that the Saxons really did invade at that time and cause significant trouble for the Britons. So if we count this 150-year period from there, which is the earliest notable Saxon plundering of Britain, then we get to about the middle of the 6th century. It would actually take us to 559 to be exact, but I think it's fair enough to say it's an approximate period of 150 years, 1.5 centuries. So that takes us to about the middle of the 6th century. That fits in very well with my date of about 549 or 548, but it doesn't work at all with the date of about 500, as is most commonly supported. But again, if the Battle of Badon really did happen in about 500, then why did Gildas even mention the prophecy? Why even bring it up? So I think that there's good reason to believe that this prophecy, in whatever form it took, whether it was made up after the fact, or whether it was just a genuine prediction that happened to work out, in any case, I think we can trust, based on the fact that Gildas mentioned it, that the Battle of Badon did occur approximately 1.5 centuries after the Saxons first started plundering Britain, which would tie in with a mid-6th century date for the Battle of Badon, not a date at the beginning of the 6th century.